You deserve nothing, Olivia. You never have. My mother Carmen's voice sliced through the mahogany-paneled conference room like a scalpel, each word designed to draw blood. At 29, I'd heard these declarations my entire life, but sitting in that leather chair watching her pace behind my sister Brooklyn felt different. Final. The weight of her cruelty pressed against my chest as she continued her performance for the lawyers who were running late. If you're ready to witness the most devastating family betrayal and the sweetest revenge that followed, smash that like button, subscribe to Formidable Revenge channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens when I slide that document across the table. Brooklyn, 3 years younger and forever golden in our mother's eyes, drummed her perfectly manicured nails against the conference table. Her smile radiated the confidence of someone who believed victory was guaranteed. The ornate grandfather clock in the corner marked each second until the moment that would shatter everything they thought they knew. Grandma Stella always knew Brooklyn was special, Carmen declared, her eyes gleaming with vindictive satisfaction. Beautiful, charming, everything a grandmother could want. You were just there. An obligation. The familiar sting of her words hit like it always did, but something deeper, a quiet strength I'd cultivated over 3 years of managing Grandma Stella's affairs, kept me steady. Carmen had no idea what was coming, and I found myself almost grateful for her cruelty. It would make what happened next feel like justice rather than revenge. I can't wait to redecorate Grandma's house, Brooklyn said dreamily, already planning her inheritance. Those antiques are so outdated. I'm thinking modern minimalist, maybe some of those expensive Italian fixtures I saw in Architectural Digest. Carmen beamed with pride. Whatever you want, darling. Stella's savings should cover renovations easily. $25,000 goes quite far when you're smart about spending. I watched them discuss their plans, feeling like a ghost in my own family. They spoke about Grandma Stella's house, her jewelry collection, her modest savings account with such certainty, such entitlement. Not once did they mention the 3 years I'd spent visiting Stella every Tuesday and Thursday, helping her organize papers, listening to her stories about business investments she'd carefully hidden from my mother's gambling addiction. The door handle turned. I straightened in my chair as the lawyers entered, carrying briefcases and wearing expressions that suggested this reading would be anything but routine. Carmen smoothed her hair and adjusted her jacket, preparing to collect what she believed was rightfully Brooklyn's. What my mother didn't know was that Grandma Stella had been far more perceptive than anyone gave her credit for, and infinitely wealthier than my family had ever imagined. The months leading up to this moment had been filled with a careful dance between my grandmother and me, one that my mother and sister had been too self-absorbed to notice. Every Tuesday and Thursday for 3 years, I'd driven 45 minutes from my apartment in downtown Phoenix to Grandma Stella's modest house in Scottsdale, ostensibly to help with household tasks and provide companionship. What actually happened during those visits was far more complex. Stella would brew her signature lavender tea, settle into her favorite armchair, and begin discussing her little projects, business investments she'd been making for over 2 decades. Most people saw Stella as a sweet elderly woman living on Social Security and a small pension from her late husband's construction job. The reality was that she owned controlling interests in 5 different companies, ranging from a successful catering business to a profitable real estate development firm. Carmen has a problem, Olivia, Stella had confided during one of our early conversations. I've watched her gamble away 3 different windfalls over the years, her father's life insurance, the settlement from her car accident, even the money I gave her for Brooklyn's college fund. All of it disappeared into those casino machines. I'd suspected as much. Carmen's frequent business trips to nearby casinos, her mood swings that coincided with mysterious financial stress, and her constant requests for loans from Stella had painted a clear picture. What I hadn't realized was how methodically Stella had been protecting her assets from my mother's addiction. I need someone I can trust to help me manage these investments, Stella had said, sliding a folder across her kitchen table. Someone who won't see dollar signs and forget about responsibility. The folder contained corporate documents, financial statements, and partnership agreements worth approximately $18 million. Stella had spent decades quietly building this business empire, reinvesting profits and expanding her holdings while maintaining the facade of a simple retiree. She'd chosen me as her successor not out of favoritism, but out of necessity. Carmen's gambling debts had put creditors on alert, and they were already circling Stella's estate like vultures. "Your mother believes I have $25,000 in savings and a house worth maybe $200,000, Stella had explained with a slight smile. Let her continue believing that. These businesses need protection from her creditors, and more importantly, they need someone who understands their value." Mr. Peterson, the primary estate attorney, was a distinguished man in his 60s who'd worked with Stella for over 15 years. He cleared his throat and opened the official will document, his reading glasses perched carefully on his nose. Carmen and Brooklyn leaned forward eagerly while I remained composed, my heart beating steadily as the moment approached. "The last will and testament of Stella Margaret Thompson," Mr. Peterson began formally. "I, Stella Margaret Thompson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my worldly possessions as follows." Carmen gripped Brooklyn's hand, both women barely containing their excitement. They'd been anticipating this moment for months, ever since Stella's health had begun declining. I watched them with a mixture of sadness and determination, knowing their joy would be short-lived but necessary. "To my granddaughter Brooklyn, I leave my family home at 1247 Maple Street, including all furnishings, fixtures, and personal belongings contained within. Additionally, I bequeath to Brooklyn my complete jewelry collection and the contents of my savings account at Desert National Bank." Brooklyn squealed with delight, her hands flying to her mouth in theatrical surprise. Carmen began crying tears of what appeared to be gratitude, though I suspected they were tears of relief at securing what she believed would solve her mounting debts. They embraced dramatically, while Mr. Peterson continued reading the formal language of the bequest. "The jewelry alone must be worth $40,000, Carmen whispered loudly to Brooklyn. "And that house is in such a desirable neighborhood now." I felt a familiar pang of exclusion as they celebrated, but it was quickly replaced by anticipation. Stella had warned me this moment would be difficult, that watching them receive what they believed was everything would test my resolve. She'd been right. Seeing their triumphant faces, hearing their immediate plans to liquidate Stella's memory for cash, made my chest tighten with grief and anger. "To my granddaughter Olivia," Mr. Peterson continued, "I leave my collection of business documents and corporate files housed in the filing cabinet in my home office." Carmen actually laughed, a harsh, mocking sound that echoed through the conference room. "Business documents? What business documents? Mother never had any business besides collecting Social Security." Brooklyn giggled along with her mother. "Poor Olivia gets the boring paperwork while I get the house and jewelry. I guess that's fitting." They exchanged a look of shared amusement, their cruelty casual and automatic. I absorbed their mockery without reaction, knowing their laughter would turn to something very different within minutes. Mr. Peterson closed the will and set it aside, but he made no move to conclude the meeting. Instead, he looked directly at me with an expression that suggested the real business was just beginning. As Carmen and Brooklyn continued their whispered celebration, a second attorney entered the conference room. Rebecca Martinez was a sharp-featured woman in her 40s who specialized in corporate law, and her presence immediately shifted the atmosphere. She carried a thick briefcase and wore the kind of confident expression that suggested she held information that would change everything. "Ladies," Mr. Peterson said, "I'd like you to meet Rebecca Martinez from Silver Pine Holdings. She has additional documents that pertain to Stella's estate." Carmen barely looked up from her conversation with Brooklyn about redecorating plans. "Additional documents? What kind of additional documents?" The will was very clear. Rebecca settled into her chair and opened her briefcase with deliberate precision. "Mr. Peterson is correct that the will addresses Stella's personal property, her home, jewelry, and savings account. However, those items represent only a small fraction of Stella's total assets." Brooklyn's head snapped up from her phone where she'd been texting friends about her inheritance. What do you mean, small fraction? Grandma wasn't wealthy. She lived in that tiny house and drove that old Honda. Stella Thompson was indeed very wealthy, Rebecca replied calmly. She simply chose to live modestly while building a substantial business empire. For the past 22 years, she owned controlling interests in 5 different companies, managed through a complex but legal corporate structure designed to protect her assets. The color began draining from Carmen's face. Business empire? That's impossible. My mother worked at the post office for 30 years and then retired. She never mentioned any businesses. I watched my mother's confidence start to crumble as Rebecca spread corporate documents across the conference table. The papers bore Stella's signature, notarized dates going back decades, and financial statements that showed profits in the millions. Carmen picked up one document with trembling fingers, scanning the numbers with growing horror. These companies, Rebecca continued, include Southwest Peak Engineering, a civil engineering firm that's contracted with the State Highway Department for 15 years. Desert Publishing, which owns the rights to several successful regional magazines. Cactus Bloom Foods, a catering company that services major corporate events throughout the Southwest. How much? Veronica's voice cracked. How much are these companies worth? The combined value, based on the most recent appraisals, is approximately $18 million. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. Carmen made a small choking sound while Brooklyn gripped the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Their celebration had transformed into stunned silence, replaced by the dawning realization that they'd been operating under completely false assumptions about Stella's wealth. Where did the money come from? Carmen whispered. How could she afford to buy businesses? Rebecca consulted her notes. Stella began investing in 2002, using her father's life insurance settlement as initial capital. Instead of spending that money, she partnered with existing business owners who needed investors. Over time, she acquired controlling interests through careful reinvestment of profits. She was, by all accounts, an extremely shrewd businesswoman. I watched my mother's face cycle through disbelief, confusion, and growing dread. Carmen had always dismissed Stella as a simple woman who needed taking care of, never recognizing the sharp intelligence that had built an empire right under everyone's noses. The condescension Carmen had shown toward Stella's little hobbies was now revealed as willful blindness to her mother's remarkable success. But why didn't she tell us? Brooklyn demanded. Why keep it secret? Rebecca's expression grew serious. Stella was very concerned about protecting these assets from potential creditors. She had observed certain gambling habits within the family and wanted to ensure that her business empire would remain intact. Carmen's face flushed red with humiliation and rage. The carefully hidden truth about her addiction was now exposed in front of lawyers and documented in corporate files that could never be denied or dismissed. Rebecca reached into her briefcase and withdrew another set of documents, these ones bearing more recent dates and signatures. Stella updated her corporate succession plan 18 months ago after careful consideration of who should inherit control of these businesses. Carmen lunged forward in her chair. Brooklyn is her primary heir. The will clearly states. The will addresses Stella's personal property, Rebecca interrupted firmly. Corporate ownership operates under different legal structures. These businesses were never part of her personal estate. They were held in trust with designated successors chosen based on Stella's assessment of their business acumen and financial responsibility. Who inherits the businesses? Brooklyn asked, her voice strained with anxiety. Rebecca turned to face me directly. Olivia Thompson has been designated as the primary successor for all 5 companies. She's been working closely with Stella for the past 3 years, learning the operations and meeting with management teams. The transition is designed to be seamless. The silence that followed was deafening. Carmen stared at me as if seeing a stranger, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Brooklyn's perfect composure shattered completely, her face contorting with disbelief and fury. That's impossible, Carmen finally managed to say. Olivia doesn't know anything about business. She's never shown any interest in. I've been learning about these companies for 3 years, I said quietly, speaking for the first time since the lawyers had arrived. Every Tuesday and Thursday when I visited. Grandma Stella, we went over financial reports, met with managers, and discussed long-term strategy. She was an incredible teacher. Brooklyn's eyes filled with tears of rage. You knew? You knew about the money this whole time and said nothing. Stella asked me to keep the businesses confidential until after her death, I replied calmly. She was concerned about protecting them from outside interference. Carmen's face twisted with understanding. Outside interference? You mean my debts? Rebecca nodded. Stella was very explicit about her concerns. She had observed multiple instances where family resources were lost to gambling debts, and she wanted to ensure that her business empire remained stable and productive. The weight of the revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Carmen realized that not only had she underestimated her own mother's wealth and intelligence, but that her gambling addiction had cost her family access to millions of dollars. Her years of condescension toward Stella, her dismissal of Stella's boring conversations about investments, had blinded her to the empire being built right in front of her. 18 million? Brooklyn whispered, as if saying the number might make it less real. 18 million and you get all of it? I inherited the responsibility of managing these companies, I corrected. Stella built something remarkable, and she trusted me to continue her work. Carmen stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. This isn't fair. Brooklyn is the primary heir. There has to be some way to contest this. Rebecca's expression remained professional but firm. The corporate succession has been legally established for years. Every document has been properly notarized, witnessed, and filed with appropriate authorities. Stella worked with multiple attorneys to ensure there would be no grounds for contest. The trap Stella had laid was perfect in its simplicity. She'd given Carmen and Brooklyn exactly what they expected while protecting what truly mattered from their potential interference. Carmen began pacing behind her chair like a caged animal, her earlier triumph now transformed into desperate calculation. There has to be something we can do. Some legal challenge. Some way to prove that Mother wasn't in her right mind when she made these arrangements. Rebecca opened another folder with practiced efficiency. Stella anticipated such concerns. She underwent comprehensive psychological evaluation 6 months ago, specifically to demonstrate her mental competency. The results show her cognitive function was well above average for her age group. I watched my mother's face as each avenue of denial was systematically closed off. Stella had thought of everything, spending years building legal barriers that would protect her businesses from the very scenario unfolding now. Carmen's gambling addiction, her pattern of viewing family resources as her own personal bank account, had finally met an obstacle she couldn't manipulate or overcome. But the house, Brooklyn said desperately. At least I still have the house and jewelry. That's something. Rebecca consulted her notes with an expression that suggested more bad news. Unfortunately, there are some complications regarding those assets as well. Stella's creditors have been monitoring the estate, and there are significant liens against both the property and the jewelry collection. Carmen's face went white. Liens? What liens? Your gambling debts, Carmen. Several casinos have obtained judgments against you over the past 2 years. They've been waiting for Stella's estate to settle so they could collect against any inherited assets. The house and jewelry will need to be liquidated to satisfy those obligations. The final piece of Stella's protection strategy became clear. She'd known that any assets left to Brooklyn would ultimately end up in Carmen's hands, and from there would be seized by creditors. By giving Brooklyn the house and jewelry, Stella had effectively given her nothing, worse than nothing, since Brooklyn would now be responsible for the legal proceedings required to transfer the assets to the casinos. Brooklyn collapsed back into her chair, tears streaming down her face. So I get nothing? Nothing at all. You'll receive whatever remains after the creditors are satisfied, Mr. Peterson said gently. Unfortunately, given the value of the liens versus the appraised value of the property and jewelry, there's unlikely to be any significant remainder. Carmen turned to face me with an expression of pure hatred. You planned this. You manipulated her into cutting us out. I helped Grandma Stella manage her businesses, I replied steadily. Everything else was her decision based on her observations of this family over many years. This isn't over, Carmen snarled. I'll find a way to fight this. I'll prove that you influenced her, that you took advantage of an elderly woman. Rebecca's voice cut through Carmen's threats with professional authority. I should mention that Stella documented her reasoning extensively. She kept detailed records of family interactions, including recordings of conversations where gambling debts were discussed. She also documented instances where family members made disparaging comments about her intelligence or business acumen. The recordings. I remembered Stella's small digital recorder, which she'd started using after Carmen made particularly cruel comments about Stella's supposed senility. My grandmother had been building a legal defense against exactly the kind of challenge Carmen was threatening to mount. Carmen sank into her chair, the fight draining out of her as she realized the scope of Stella's preparation. Every contingency had been considered, every possible objection anticipated and countered. Stella had spent 3 years not just teaching me about her businesses, but building an unassailable legal fortress around the succession plan. I reached into my purse and withdrew a sealed envelope that Stella had given me 6 months before her death. Grandma Stella asked me to give this to both of you after the legal proceedings were complete. Carmen and Brooklyn stared at the envelope as if it might explode. Their faces bore the hollow expressions of people who just watched their entire worldview collapse. With trembling fingers, Carmen opened the envelope and unfolded the handwritten letter inside. My dear Carmen and Brooklyn, Carmen read aloud, her voice breaking. If you are reading this, then my business empire has been revealed, and you understand the true scope of what you have lost. I want you to know that this was not a decision I made lightly. Brooklyn leaned over to read along, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Carmen continued reading, her voice growing smaller with each word. Carmen, your gambling addiction has cost this family more than you realize. The money you asked me for over the years, the loans you never repaid, they came from profits these businesses generated. I calculated that your debts have cost the family over $300,000 in the past 5 years alone. Carmen's hands shook as she held the letter. She kept track. Brooklyn, Carmen read on, you have never shown interest in anything beyond spending money and acquiring material possessions. When I tried to discuss my investments with you, you dismissed them as boring old lady hobbies. You made it clear that you saw me as nothing more than a source of inheritance. Brooklyn sobbed openly now, the weight of her grandmother's disappointment finally reaching her. Olivia, on the other hand, spent 3 years learning about these businesses, not because she wanted to inherit them, but because she genuinely cared about my well-being and respected my intelligence. She never asked me for money, never dismissed my accomplishments, and never treated me like a burden. Carmen finished reading the letter, her voice barely a whisper. I leave these businesses to Olivia because she has earned them through dedication, respect, and genuine love. What you inherit, or fail to inherit, is the result of choices you made over many years. I hope you learn from this experience, though I fear you may not. Love, Mother. The conference room fell silent except for Brooklyn's quiet crying. Carmen stared at the letter for a long moment before carefully folding it and placing it back in the envelope. When she looked up at me, her expression had changed from anger to something closer to defeat. She really planned all of this. Every detail. Yes, I replied. She spent 3 years making sure everything would be legally protected and properly documented. 6 months later, Carmen and Brooklyn discovered that the gambling debts had grown far beyond what they initially realized. With compound interest and legal fees, the total load had ballooned to nearly $500,000. The house and jewelry, after appraisals and legal costs, barely covered half the debt, leaving Carmen personally liable for the remainder and forcing her into bankruptcy. Brooklyn, now tied to her mother's financial choices, lost her credit rating and social standing when the bankruptcy became public record. Their extended family and social circle learned the full scope of the gambling addiction that had cost them millions. Both women were forced to find employment for the first time in years, working entry-level positions while I managed a business empire worth $18 million, a daily reminder of how their cruelty and entitlement had cost them everything. Looking back on that day in the conference room, I realized that Grandma Stella had given me more than just financial security. She taught me that true power comes from earning respect rather than demanding it, and that the most satisfying revenge is simply allowing people to face the natural consequences of their own choices. Drop a comment below telling me what you thought of Stella's master plan, and don't forget to subscribe to Formidable Revenge channel for more stories of justice served cold. The next story will blow your mind even more.